John, Susan, Titi, and Roger Walker were in a small rowboat. They had arrived in Pinmill yesterday and was doing a little exploring. They came across a black boy floating on the water with the name Goblin on it. Very soon, a white yacht with red sails was coming in towards where the boy was. The man on the yacht yelled out to John to help him tie a rope to the boy. The man on the yacht is Jim Brading. Jim was living on his yacht until the time comes when he has to attend university. The children were fascinated by the space where he eats and sleeps. Jim had an idea. He asked the Walker children if they would like to spend the night on the yacht. The children were excited, but they would have to ask Mother's permission. They asked Jim to join them for a meal. During dinner, however, Jim could not keep his eyes open. He had been sailing the whole night. Slowly, he laid his head down and was fast asleep. The next morning, Jim had a talk with Mrs. Walker about the idea of the children spending the night in his yacht. Mrs. Walker was reluctant, but after asking around the village about Jim and much persuading from her children, she agreed. While the children made preparations to camp on board, Jim showed Mrs. Walker a chart. They will sail down from Pinmill to Harwich on the River Orwell, but not past the Beach End Buoy because that would mean going out to open sea. Jim promised to bring the children back 2 days later because their father would be coming home from sea. Mother and Bridget got back on the rowboat. They waved goodbye to Jim and the 4 children in the yacht. Jim taught John and Susan how to steer with the tiller. They soon got the hang of it and felt excited. They saw a porpoise in the river. Soon they arrived near the pier and decided to have some supper. As they were having supper, Jim was explaining to John about shoals. Shoals are certain places in the river where the water is shallow, and if you're not careful, your ship could hit the ground. After supper, everyone went to bed. The next day, they arrived in the town of Harwich. The Goblin sailed till just before the Beach End Buoy. It's time to turn back. They will be using the engine instead of sails. But the engine started and died down. Jim had forgotten to fill it with petrol. "How silly of me!" Jim exclaimed. Jim will have to row ashore to get some petrol. He instructed John to let the anchor down. While Jim was away, the children had breakfast. They waited for Jim, but after 2 hours, they started to get worried. Fog was coming in from the sea with the tide. John and Susan heard noises of the anchor chain. John went to look. He cried out. They were drifting off to open sea. The high tide had made the anchor shorter. He had forgotten to release the chain, and now the anchor was not touching the bottom. The Goblin was wobbling and drifting, but the children could not see past the thick fog. They heard the sound of a loud bell. Bang! Bang! The Goblin was close enough to the buoy for them to reach Beach End. They were in open sea. The children started to panic. Titi started to feel sick because the wobbling had gotten more intense. Susan was in tears. John had to act quickly. He decided to put up the sails. They were in open sea, but the least he could do is steer in a direction. John had a look at the chart. The only way to be safe was to sail past the sunk lightship. There would be too many shoals around before that, and it would be disastrous if they encountered one. Susan protested. They promised their mother they wouldn't go to sea. She started to cry. John was frustrated. They can't go back in the thick fog. The only safest way was to go forward. Titi felt really sick. Susan brought her to the cabin to lie down. As they were struggling to steer the Goblin, the weather took a turn for the worst. The wind was strong and it threw the ship to one side. As it landed back waves of water flew up into the cockpit. John was desperate and scared. Slowly but surely, the Goblin was soon set to a steady course again. It was like coming out from a battle and savoring the peace. The children had to pump the water out from the ship. At the end, they were all tired and hungry. So far, they still haven't found the lightship. Susan took over the tiller while John laid his head down for a little rest. He had planned just take a short nap, but soon he was in deep sleep, exhausted from all the feats. When he woke up, Susan told John that they had already passed the lightship. Now the question was, should they go back or sail on till they find a harbor? John decided it was best to sail on because it would take longer to go back the same way, and after all that ordeal, he can't bear the thought of going through that experience again. From that point on, Susan no longer pleaded that they turn back. They were in open sea. They had broken their promise to Mother. There was nothing they can do about it now except wire her a telegram explaining everything. As they were sailing, there were a lot of wood floating in the sea. Suddenly, they spotted the body of a small brown cat on a box. The children scrambled to the side. John stretched his body over to reach the box, while the other children held on to his legs. He quickly grabbed the cat and was pulled back safely onto the Goblin. The children took the cat to the cabin and gave it some milk. They named him Sinbad. The cat was too weak at first to even have any milk, but soon it opened its mouth and took in the drink hungrily. "Land! Land ahead!" yelled John from the top of the mast. There was also a ship ahead which looked to be anchored. They could approach the ship and ask its pilot to show them the nearest harbor. The pilot of the big ship took them to the harbor. As they were nearing it, they saw another ship. The pilot explained that ship will be sailing to Harwich. John was surprised to see a familiar face. "Ahoy there!" shouted the man. John exclaimed, "It's Daddy!" The pilot asked John to get the captain of the Goblin. John had to explain that actually there was no captain and that the children had sailed in open sea from Harwich all the way here. The pilot could not believe his ears. 4 children had sailed in a little ship from Harwich to Holland. A small motorboat was approaching them. Daddy was in the boat. The children were so happy that they all started speaking at once. Susan was so happy and relieved she started to cry. The pilot laughed out loud, still in disbelief. But he took them to the nearest inner harbor and he would not take a dime for his effort. They had to send a telegram to Mother quickly. She must be worried sick, wondering what had happened to the children. Daddy took care of the telegram. He also bought supplies, and when the tide was right, they sailed away in the Goblin back to Harwich. Meanwhile, Jim Brading had woken up in a strange place with the most terrible headache. He touched his head and felt bandages wrapped around it. He could not remember what had happened in the last few days. Suddenly, he remembered the Goblin and the children. Jim quickly looked for his clothes and he left the building of what looked like a hospital. He tried piecing the puzzle together. He had jumped in front of a bus because of an old lady in front of him. But now all that mattered was getting to the harbor to look for his yacht and the children. Jim saw the Goblin from far away. He got on a rowboat and started making his way to the Goblin. The children saw him and they yelled with delight. Jim was very confused, even more confused that Mr. Walker was standing in his yacht that had sailed from Holland. With Jim being in the hospital, it basically meant that Mrs. Walker still had no idea what's going on. They continued their journey to Pinmill. Mother and Bridget were there waiting for them. As soon as she got on board, she asked a lot of questions. She was angry at them for breaking their promises, and even more angry that they missed their chance to meet Daddy. But her displeasure quickly turned to confusion when she saw Jim breathing with bandages on his head and a cat on deck. Even more surprising was Mr. Walker standing there. This was all too much for Mrs. Walker. Roger tried to explain that they met Daddy in Holland, but Mrs. Walker thought it was one of his jokes. She demanded an explanation from Jim. Jim was too dazed to even say anything. Daddy promised to tell her everything. As the children watched Daddy and Mother go ashore, they heaved a sigh of relief. They didn't mean to break their promise, and they didn't mean to go to sea. Daddy will surely tell Mother that everything will be all right.